Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Punishment in Society Digital Speaker Series. Punishment in Society is a collaborative research network, or CRN, of the Law and Society Association. You can find past DSS talks on our website. Today, we hear from Amber Joy Powell, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Iowa. She will be discussing "We Can't Prove This Happened" or "It Didn't Happen," responding to youth-identified sexual threats in juvenile detention. At the end of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. You can put your question or name in the chat anytime to get a queue going, or you can raise your virtual hand during the Q&A. As a reminder, we are recording this session, so if you do not want to be on camera, please feel free to post your question in the chat. Before I turn it over to Amber Joy, I want to announce that our next installment of the Digital Speaker Series will feature Brendan Beck from the University of Colorado, Denver, presenting "Do Austerity Cuts Spare Police Budgets? Recessions and the Shift from Social Provision to Law Enforcement in U.S. Cities." And with that, I turn it over to you, Amber Joy.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's so wonderful to be here with you all today. I just want to take a moment to say thank you for attending the session and for being in conversation with me as I'm working through some of these ideas. And of course, special thanks to Ashley Rubin for organizing the series and just giving us a platform to be able to engage with each other's work. So today I want to share some of the ongoing qualitative work that I've been doing around sexual violence in youth detention facilities. And the purpose of this project is really to sort of shift our understanding of thinking about sexual violence as being solely interpersonal and really developing a more institutional and intersectional framework for conceptualizing what sexual violence looks like, how it's experienced, and then how these penal institutions are responding to the violence that people are talking about. And so before I continue, I think it's really important just to note that I do include descriptions of youth sexual abuse in this presentation. And I recognize that hearing those descriptions is probably difficult for many of us who've either experienced that or directly or indirectly, but I think it's important to include those descriptions. And my purpose for doing that is not to try to reproduce any sort of spectacle around children's violence, but rather to really uncover the institutional and legal conditions that produce and oftentimes erase that violence in the first place. So I want to draw your attention to one of the first complaints of sexual misconduct that I reviewed for this project. And it comes from an African-American boy who I'll call Amir. And in 2017, Amir files a sexual harassment complaint against one of the male guards who he accused of staring at his body while, quote unquote, making gay comments to him in the shower. And so in the following quote from the interview with the investigator, Amir shares his attempts to address what he considers to be a routine sexual misconduct. So he says, we'd be in the showers and stuff. And then he would make a comment like, wash your little wieners and get your ass out the showers. Like he'd say stuff like that. And it would just creep me out because he's making the comment about the size of our penises. And he's standing there watching us naked. And anytime we asked him, like, can we shower with our drawers on and have a little privacy? He was like, no, it's a health thing. Everyone's got to take their drawers off. You got to shower completely naked. And he would just talk to us like we was dogs, like just pure animals. The security director, the warden, anybody you go talk to, nothing gets done. And it seems like it would always come back on you 10 times harder. And so Amir is then, over the course of this interview, he's questioned by the investigator as to how he knows for sure that the guard was sexually aroused by the comments he was making. And the investigator even asks Amir if he noticed whether the guard had an erection. And so Amir responds that while he didn't witness the guard's arousal, he believed that he had to have been aroused because, quote, who would want to sit there and watch kids shower naked? And so for Amir, this is commonsensical. And had he not been incarcerated, the law would likely agree with him. But within the context of these penal institutions, this guard surveillance is condoned as maintaining the safety and the security of the facility. Yet for Amir, quote, there's no such thing as a good search when you grab my private parts and shake them in your hand. And yet still the investigator ultimately dismisses Amir's claim, stating that there was no proof beyond his own words that this guard had any sexual intent, nor that he said anything sexual to him or other youth. And so Amir himself is actually the one who faces reprimand for disrespecting the guard by calling him a homophobic slur. So Amir's account of these invasive searches and forced public nudity as sexual threats not only calls us to question the power arrangements within the institution that routinely expose his body to adults, but also to the penal logics that deem that sort of forced nudity as neither sexual nor violent due to the healthy safety and security of that particular facility. And so what Amir experienced is quite common in the context of youth incarceration. And I would talk about this quite a bit to a lot of the participants that I spoke to over the course of the project. And so during a conversation with the victim service coordinator, he revealed that it's precisely what Amir described is often how sexual violence manifests itself within these institutions. He says, our experiences with our clients and our survivors is that something that looks like a TV or a movie, someone dragged into an empty cell and raped, is actually pretty rare. What sexual assault looks like is much more coercive and so much more in line with the entirety of the prison system does to people. It's strip searches, it's protective pairings, it's rampant sexual harassment, but in a way that no one recognizes because it's just the water that everyone swims in. We hear way more about those kinds of things, and it really looks a lot more like people controlling other people's bodies. A random stranger you don't know is about to touch you, and most of the time doesn't particularly care how you're feeling about it and isn't going to do it gently. And that's what's doing the damage for folks. And so now, as many Black feminist scholars have pointed out, state sexual violence has long been inflicted onto racially criminalized communities. Sexual degradation remains embedded within the very design of penal institutions, hence why we see a lot of forced public nudity in the first place. Yet it wasn't until the 1990s and early 2000s that we start to see a shift in the mainstream political agenda around the mobilization of prison sexual violence. And this led to the passing of the Prison Rape Elimination Act in 2003, also known as PREA. And so on the books, PREA, or the purpose of PREA, is to try to develop and implement national standards for the detection, prevention, reduction, and punishment of prison rape. In addition to creating statistical data on the incidence and prevalence of prison rape, PREA also develops a formalized grievance system to address sexual harassment and abuse in juvenile detention facilities and prisons, jails, and lockups, as well as community facilities. And so under this grievance system, incarcerated youth are supposed to have access to confidential reporting, thorough investigations, and no retaliation if they do decide to report. The investigators, in turn, are then responsible for conducting these investigations under the preponderance of evidence standard. And so one of the great things about PREA, or one thing that PREA has produced that's been really great, is the survey data about the incidence and prevalence of sexual victimization. So according to the most recent estimates from the National Survey of Youth in Custody from 2018, 7.1% of boys, 6.6% of girls, and almost 20% of trans youth reported some form of victimization, some form of sexual victimization in the last 12 months. And when we say sexual victimization, this includes everything, a range of sexual acts from penetration, but also kissing, being shown something sexual, and making sexually suggestive remarks. What perhaps might be surprising for some is that 91% of youth who report staff sexual misconduct are male youth who are accusing women staff. Girls are actually more likely to be victimized by other girls. And so similar to what we see in the community, most victims never formally report their sexual abuse to correctional authorities. But out of the ones who do, the survey of sexual victimization, which tracks the number of formally reported allegations, indicates that almost 80% of youth on youth allegations and more than 90% of staff on youth complaints are either unfounded, meaning the allegation is founded to be false, or unsubstantiated, meaning there is an insufficient amount of evidence to determine whether or not the incident occurred. And so the previous research that we have on legal consciousness and mobilization show that victims of sexual harassment and abuse face multiple individual and institutional level barriers to reporting and substantiating their complaints. And this includes everything from self-blame, questions about their credibility, organizational investments in avoiding liability, and potential retaliation from their supervisors. The small but emerging scholarship that we have on prisoner grievances also suggests that despite their vulnerability and cynicism towards internal grievance processes, incarcerated communities still do engage with these systems in order to exercise their rights in the midst of their observing wrongdoings against them. And we also see in the literature some critiques of prison administrators who use these internal grievance processes and this zero tolerance around sexual abuse to regulate and criminalize mutually desired relationships among LGBTQ adults. And so, despite this robust scholarship that we have on legal consciousness and mobilization, few sociolegal scholars have examined the organizational decision-making processes within the context of sexual misconduct in penal institutions, and even less that focus on incarcerated youth. And so youth incarceration as a site of sexual violence is often missing in both the feminist scholarship on gender-based violence and also within the punishment scholarship on the social and political consequences of criminal justice contact. And so in reflecting upon the survey data, as well as the data that I opened up with, these complaints of sexual misconduct, I pose three interrelated questions that I want to work through with you all today. And the first is trying to first identify what interactions are incarcerated youth recognizing as sexual threats in the first place. And then how are these incarcerated youth then using PREA, or the Prison Rape Elimination Act, to mobilize and address these sexual threats? And then lastly, I'm curious as to how these penal institutions then, in response, are determining what constitutes a legitimate sexual threat and what doesn't. And so in order to do this, I'm using data from interviews that I conducted with various legal actors who've done PREA implementation, as well as 35 written investigations of sexual misconduct that's occurred in youth detention facilities. And I show here that incarcerated youth mobilize prison rape law to contest a spectrum of what I call sexual threats, both from other youth and from staff. And while investigators are guided by these formal rules of evidence assessment under the preponderance of evidence, in practice, these rules remain embedded in penal logics about what constitutes consensual, non-consensual, violent, non-violent, and sexual, non-sexual interactions. And so to answer these questions, what I did in this project was really attempt to try to immerse myself in the legal landscape of PREA, and particularly as that involves youth. And so I started looking online and finding contact information for people that had done PREA audits, PREA compliance managers, coordinators, and investigators. So people that really have direct experience working on PREA implementation. And so in total, I interviewed over 76 legal actors. And this also included formerly incarcerated survivors, which I won't talk about today, but I'm more than happy to get into that in the Q&A. And then in addition to doing all of these interviews, I collected over 150 legal documents, including these investigative reports, lawsuits, congressional testimonies, and attended several virtual observations of prison rape reform events. So for the purposes of today's talk, I really want to center these investigative reports that include youth complaints of sexual misconduct. So what I did was I sent out a bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests to various Department of Corrections, asking if they could provide these complaints. And so I'm sure many of you can imagine the answer was no for most of them, but a few states actually did agree to give me some of these complaints. Now they're heavily redacted, as you can see from the example on the right. But they overall includes roughly 800 pages of documentation that I was able to collect. And so from that, I tried to get half staff on youth complaints and half youth on youth investigations. And I was able to do that. And so for my analysis, I really tried to triangulate between what the formal policies are around PREA investigations, then using those interviews to see how people are talking about those investigations, and then lastly, including these investigative reports to see what people are doing on the ground when they're making these decisions about what constitutes a legitimate sexual threat. And so here's my sort of initial categorizing of the sexual threats that youth discussed in their initial complaints. And I want to be clear too that, the reason that I'm using this language of sexual threat as opposed to sexual assault or sexual misconduct is because I feel like it's more reflective of the spectrum of actions that people would talk about. So, for example, youth, especially male youth, would oftentimes talk about other male youth or other staff doing quote unquote gay things to them, right? And they would talk about, someone who expressed romantic interest in them as that being a PREA charge or predatory or sexual misconduct. And so in my mind, I was trying to work through, it felt weird to call that sexual assault or sexual violence. And so I felt like a sexual threat better encompassed that how they're sort of perceiving or their own subjectivity and how they perceive threats to their heteromasculinity. And so we'll get into some of those examples in a little bit. But from youth on youth allegations, we see, sexual bullying, unwanted sexual comments and sexual attention. Staff allegations, they include a lot of the things that we talked about earlier, like strip searches and forced public nudity, but also these quote unquote romantic relationships where youth believe that they're having a guard might be their girlfriend or might be their boyfriend, and that these relationships are consensual, and they talk about that. But it also includes staff fraternization. And I've seen, cases where guards are twerking in front of youth, and youth are then complaining about that being sexual misconduct. So it really spans a spectrum. And I think what's really important to note here, and I'll talk about a few of these examples in a moment, but I want to first discuss how these legal actors viewed these sexual misconduct cases themselves. And so two of the questions that I would oftentimes ask PREA personnel was, one, what does sexual misconduct look like when you're looking through it? Are these cases of forcible rape? Are these cases where people believe they're in relationships? Like, what does it look like? Because I wanted to see if what they were seeing was similar to what I was seeing in these investigative reports. And for the first question, participants were unanimous and that youth rarely alleged any sort of forcible rape. And they usually weren't talking about any sort of intercourse or penetration. Consistent with what I found in my own investigative reports, their allegations were alleging more verbal and non-penetrative sexual abuse. And so this PREA coordinator who I talked to really summarizes it nicely here. They say the majority of our allegations do fall under like the harassment level, like somebody calling somebody a name, somebody calling somebody, homosexual or picking on them, and that more to make them mad and upset. It's not really sexual. And when it gets into the sexual contact stuff, our stuff is usually or generally somebody hit somebody on the butt, smacked somebody on the butt, crowed when they walked by them, or somebody in playing basketball hit somebody in the balls. But they don't really like each other. The game got heated, and then they made an allegation after the game or something like that. Everybody's right there watching, and then they say, well, he grabbed me in the testicles. And so the second question that I would sometimes ask, or usually ask these legal actors is, well, what does evidence then look like? If this is not, these are usually not cases where where there's a lot of sexual contact, and this is mostly sexual harassment or touching. What does the evidence then look like if you're trying to follow this preponderance of evidence standard? And so they shared that the institutional rules and policies around what constitutes real evidence actively discourage investigators from legitimizing youth claims unless there is DNA, injury, digital footage, corroborating witnesses, or a confession. And as we know, and as one PREA auditor explained, all of these are extremely rare. So this PREA auditor that I spoke to said that the majority of investigations, there's not a whole lot an investigator can do besides interview the victim, interview the alleged perpetrator, interview any possible witnesses. Most of them that I review, there's no evidence to collect because there's nothing. It's been months. And so there's nothing that they could possibly collect to decide statements. And then maybe looking back through emails and phone calls, the possibility of video is very low after 30 days. So there's not a whole lot that can be utilized. And so a lot of the time in these investigations, what you see is it's a victim and a perpetrator and their statements conflict. And unfortunately, at that point, there's nothing else that can be done except for to say it's unsubstantiated. So we can't prove this happened or it didn't happen. And so even when these forms of evidence were present, investigators are then further tasked with making distinctions between consensual, non-consensual, sexual, non-sexual, or violent, non-violent. And what I mean by that is, for example, you might have digital footage that shows a strip search took place or that shows guards were watching someone in the shower. And yet, it might still be regarded as nonviolent and non-sexual by the investigators because of these penal logics that deem those sorts of searches and that's a kind of surveillance necessary for youth safety and security. And so I want to dive into a few other examples of the types of sexual threats that oftentimes youth were talking about in these investigative reports. So several youth complained that their fellow peers exposed them to various forms of sexual degradation and bullying that was not consensual. So for example, in one case that was categorized as youth on youth sexual harassment and abuse, a 16-year-old boy accused two other boys of doing quote unquote gay stuff to him, according to the notes that were provided by the investigators report. It says that the youth victim substantially stated, "I was sitting in the day room and the two boys came out of their rooms horse playing with me. They were first fake horse playing fighting, and then they said, 'You owe some booty.' And he held down my arms and legs while another boy attempted to pull my pants. He was able to pull my pants down mid-thigh before the staff directed them to stop. They stopped and they were directed by staff. The other youth involved claimed, 'I don't know what he's talking about. And hell no, he is the one who acts gay. He is on the creepy shit. No one likes him.'" And so the investigators then in this report talk about how they review the video surveillance from the incident. And they actually were able to capture these two youth they're fighting, and these two youth attempting to then pull down the victim's pants. That was clearly against his will. But yet they also noticed that when the security staff tried to intervene, the boys did in fact stop. Yet the investigators' report concluded that after a comprehensive review of all available information, which includes incident reports, youth interviews, and video surveillance, the allegation of sexual abuse and harassment is unsubstantiated. However, the charges of insolence, horseplay, and threats and intimidation are substantiated. The accused youth has been transferred to a different location. And so here we see that this initial sexual threat, that it's not just about controlling and violating this kid's body, but it's also about the threat to his heteromasculine identity. So he couches his complaint in these homophobic logics that suggest these interactions are inherently gay because they're occurring between young boys and are thus predatory. And so a lot of the complaints that I reviewed, the perceptions of sexual safety for boys were embedded in maintaining a heterosexual identity. And while boys in other non-carceral contexts may be stigmatized for disclosing these types of incidents, formally mobilizing PREA or prison rape law in this context allows the complainant to assert his heteromasculinity by showing that these actions are not only offensive, but unwanted. Now, the investigator, in turn, then uses this discourse of horseplay and joking to obscure the sexual component of the bullying among the boys. And so in this case, the victimized boy's experience is trivialized and constructed as a routine and normalized form of play in which boys are expected to engage. The fact that the investigator unfounded the allegation of sexual harassment and abuse and yet substantiates the charge of insolence and horseplay shows how the law attempts to desexualize these interactions that are oftentimes experienced as sexual threats by boys themselves. And so another one that came up, and this is particularly with girls, where PREA personnel would talk about the sort of ambiguities around dealing with girls who they viewed as having a lot of relationship conflict. So there was a lot of gendered language around girls being very petty, girls being in conflict, girls always having drama. And so they talked about how difficult it was to suss out a legitimate claim when you have two people that might have been in a mutually desired relationship in the beginning, and maybe it turned into something else. And so one PREA compliance manager who talks about this, and she says, you know, what's tricky about youth is that we can find them at a formative point in their development, a point at which a lot of kids their age in the community are experimenting with their sexuality, experimenting with pushing boundaries, testing limits. We're getting them at a point and asking them to stop all of that, to stop exploring healthy relationships, their sexuality, boundary testing, and follow the rules. And sometimes that gets complicated when we layer on the dynamics of sexual abuse, because we're required to take seriously every allegation that's put forth. We have kids who will make allegations who may have been in a relationship with another youth, for instance, and then that gets complicated for whatever reason, and it turns into an allegation of some sort of abuse or touching or whatever the case may be. And that gets sticky. There's layers that make a youth setting more challenging. And so one example, there's several examples, but one of the examples I'll talk about today involved one girl complainant who submitted a written statement alleging sexual harassment and abuse from another girl in the facility. And in her handwritten letter to the investigator, she states that the girl that she's accusing, she likes to grab my butt in school. It mostly happens first hour because there is no camera in there. When I was in the shower, she came in the bathroom to get something out of the dryer. She bent down by the dryer and started looking under the curtain. She said, "Come down here and kiss me." She's been talking about kissing me for some time. I told her to get away, and she waited for a minute and then went away. And so the complainant further noted that the girl that she's accusing had made other sexual advances towards her, such as requesting to see her naked, trying to kiss her and cuddle with her, and telling her sexually graphic things. So during the investigator's interview with the girl that was being accused, the accused girl stated that she did write sexual things to the other youth in a letter, but she denied ever touching her. And according to the girl that was being accused, the two girls had engaged in mutual sexual contact before and had had some sex talk. But she said that everything was reciprocated and that the girl complainant and her other friends in the facility are quote unquote mad at me, so they turned me in. And so in her handwritten disciplinary investigation statement, she says that she too received letters from the victim saying that she was in love with her and that she wanted to be with her, but that the other girl had thrown them away. And so she says, "I'm being accused of forcing my peer to see my body, and that's not accurate. I have a hole in my pants, but I was wearing my undergarments to prevent exposure. I never asked her to look, and I most certainly never forced her to look. We did go together at one point, but we got into it recently because of a confrontation. I feel like these don't warrant a PREA. I know I'm innocent and I'm going to fight for my innocence. And so what was really interesting about this report is that it actually, as a part of the evidence, it includes all of these handwritten notes that investigators were able to collect. And so all of that was included, photocopies of that were included. And then the notes showed the girl that was being accused of her sort of professing her love for the victim and apologizing for hurting her. Yet in the case, the investigator is then tasked with determining whether the sexual threat lodged by the girl complainant met the legal standards for a PREA violation. And so at the root of this issue lies consent, where the accused girl argued that the handwritten notes and verbal comments she made to the complainant were reciprocated or consensual. And like sexual harassment and abuse in cases in the community, this case was further complicated by the girl's prior relationship. And while it remained unclear from the evidence provided in the report whether the complainant recognized that that relationship was a romantic one, she was clear that the recent notes she received and the attempted sexual exposure and contact from the accused made her feel uncomfortable. A sentiment that was supported by another youth witness who stated that the accused took it way too far. The accused, on the other hand, uses this language of criminal adjudication, saying that I know I'm innocent and I'm going to fight for my innocence, to combat the victim's narrative that she's somehow a threat to her sexual safety. For the accused, this was just a simple matter of a relationship conflict that didn't warrant a PREA investigation in the first place. And so, though the interviews with participants suggest that these cases involving quarrels or conflicts among girls are oftentimes trivialized or documented as simple policy violations, this investigator actually substantiated the claim, legitimizing the accused use letters as sexually explicit content as a form of sexual misconduct. Yet this, in substantiating these types of unwanted sexual attention cases, it really echoes one of the critiques about PREA, that PREA then becomes a catch-all for all sexual behavior and unfairly criminalizes LGBTQ youth sexuality and the relationships that they might wish to pursue. And so here, the accused is simply given a clear expectation that this behavior will not be tolerated, without any discussions about what healthy sexual communication might look like from the other youth. And then we also had, when thinking about staff on youth complaints, we also had, or I also saw several complaints that discussed these sort of romantic or sexual relationships that youth believed they had with adult staff members. And so in one case, there was a 23-year-old Black man who had reported that at the age of 15, he was sexually assaulted by 2 women staff at the facility that he was confined at the time. And he had a sharp memory about this. He could tell you what he was wearing, what they were wearing, when this happened, around what time, after what class. He had a very sharp memory about how all of this occurred. He named witnesses, and he was very thorough. It was one of the most thorough forensic interviews that I had witnessed. And so he told the investigators at the end, he says, I just wanted to tell my story because I could probably help some other kids to prevent them from going through what's been going on. And the reason why I basically came forward now, because it's like, it's just being investigated and it's all coming out now. So I could have come forward back then, but it's like, who's going to believe me type stuff? Like, who would believe that I was sexually assaulted in there? Who would believe me? And so, as is often the case with victims of sexual abuse, particularly male victims, they struggle to come forward and disclose those experiences of abuse for fear that they won't be believed. Now, what was interesting in the transcripts of the investigators' response was that they actually told Randall that they did believe him. So they said, you know, you're doing the right thing by coming forward with the information that you have. I don't care how long ago it was. If it happened to you then, you've got to report it. And I guess we'll just note for us is that we're going to believe everything you tell us, okay? Now, at the same time, they were mindful that they may likely not be able to substantiate Randall's case without evidence. And so they follow that up with, it doesn't mean that we're going to, automatically blindly go out and say that this happened. It just means that we're going to believe what you say. At the end of all of this, when we are done with our report, we'll send it to our boss, and our boss will review it. We'll send it to the appointing authority, whoever is overseeing the case, and they'll make a decision on what the evidence shows. And so while the investigators revealed that they believed Randall, they ultimately did dismiss his claim of sexual abuse by both women staff due to their inability to corroborate with forensic evidence, digital footage, and witnesses. And what was also interesting about this particular case was that in addition to the administrative internal grievance processes, they actually did get the local sheriff involved. And they included those notes within the investigative report as well. And so the local sheriff in his notes actually interviewed some of the witnesses and the one of the women staff who was accused, and found that nothing had happened. And then in his report actually said that, well, the victim says that this was consensual in the first place. And so even though that wasn't in the administrative report, it was in the criminal investigation as quoted by the sheriff. And so while these institutions are competing for symbolic capital by saying that they have a desire to maintain sexual safety and encourage reporting, it's these institutional barriers that hinders one's ability to actually prove that they were violated in the first place. And so I just want to end with some of the sort of socio-legal implications that I've been thinking through with some of this work. And I think the first is really trying to think through the effectiveness of prison rape law on the ground. As I talked about before, there's a lot of great work on sort of sexual harassment and abuse law, and institutions using this as a cover to talk about, to on one hand look as though they're sort of complying with mandates and encouraging reporting, when in reality, they're more interested in avoiding liability. And I think we can see the same thing that we see with Title IX or with criminal investigations. We see very similar things going on with PREA, where a lot of the people that I spoke to had a genuine interest in trying to help these kids, cared about these kids, cared about their sexual safety, and yet felt sort of constrained by the rules that they had about what constitutes sexual misconduct. And I didn't get too much into it today, and happy to talk about it in the Q&A. There was a lot of sort of gendered cultural myths around what sexual abuse looks like. So for example, this idea that girls are oftentimes using PREA to get back at each other, that was such a common trope that people would talk about. Or the fact that, or sorry, not the fact, but this discourse around boys using PREA to manipulate women staff into having sexual relationships. That was another narrative. And so it really highlights the sort of cultural and the legal constraints that these actors are working in as they're trying to determine what a legitimate sexual threat is. I think it also signals who we think is then sort of legible within penal institutions as being victims of sexual abuse. And so I guess I will stop for now, and really curious and interested to hear what your comments are. It's a paper that I'm still sort of working out, so happy to just hear what folks' thoughts are, and if they have questions that they want to follow up on, I'm more than happy to answer those as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that great talk. So please join me in offering a virtual round of applause. Yay. So we have some time for questions, and remember that we are recording. So if you don't want to be on camera, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Oh, and we have a question. Victoria, please go for it.
Hey, Amber, great job. I think you did a great job of kind of pulling out the richness of the sort of structural and cultural and social constraints that these folks investigating are sort of hemmed in on. I wondered, and I don't know if this is answerable with the data, but do you have a sense? Yeah, it's your favorite question. here's
Right.
an unanswerable one. But do you have a sense where the PREA personnel are coming from, like professionally? Like, are they recruited? Are they detectives? Are they prison admin? Are they, and did I miss that? I'm just wondering kind of what kind of professional and structural institutional norms they may be. Because I was struck at like, oh, they're repeating rape myths like throughout the presentation, right? That we sort of see popular sort of imageries of sexual abuse and assault.
Yeah.
But I'm just, yeah. But then you had that also rich example of like, oh, we believe you, but that doesn't mean we're going to substantiate. So there is like, there's like an attempt to sort of adopt a more open-minded discourse.
Yeah.
At the same time. So I'm struck by that complexity that you drew out and wondered if you could talk about them as actors and where they're coming
Absolutely. Absolutely. So most of the PREA actors that I interviewed had been doing this work, I would say, since the 1980s or 1990s. Some folks had been doing it since the 1970s. And so they've been in youth correction since long before PREA was ever really a thing. And so one of the things that we talked about was their perceptions of how sort of PREA had changed things, right? So they would talk about the old guard and the old school and how they were like these, I guess, younger, progressives in this movement that were pushing for this idea that prison rape is not a part of the punishment and that we shouldn't be, prisoners shouldn't expect to be treated in a certain way. So I would definitely say that the sample of people I interviewed, which is probably why they wanted to talk to me, were people that were really at the forefront of pushing this in their own jurisdictions. And it was people that cared about these things and felt like correctional facilities were not living up to that rehabilitative ideal that they talked about. And so I interviewed a handful of people who became auditors in the early 2010s, and they talked a lot about their training. And so they are, even though I'm sort of referencing them as PREA folks, they're really like former probation officers and former correctional officers. And so they're bringing all of that experience with them as they're sort of working through the issue. But I think what gets difficult for them is because they have that sort of prior experience is also trying to sort of grapple with, the spectrum of things that they see. And I remember very clearly interviewing several people, and they were like, for girl sexual misconduct cases, all it is she touched my butt, she touched my butt, she touched my butt. They just kept saying that. Like several people said that over and over. And even though I don't have like a representative sample or whatever, when I looked through my own sample of girls, sure enough, that's what it was. It was a lot of like, she touched my butt, she pulled my hair, she did this and that. And so you can kind of see from their perspective, like where those sort of gendered narratives are coming from. But yes, a lot of them had a lot of prior experiences, specifically working in youth corrections, and were using that in how they made their decisions.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there more questions? Joss, go for it.
Great. Oh my gosh, Amber. I mean, as you know, I just think this is some of the most exciting social punishment work out there. It's such a joy to see your scholarship. Just thank you so much for this. I want to keep thinking about it in lots of ways. I guess my question for right now is kind of thinking along the lines of Calavita and Jeunesse with the grievance process work, which you referenced. I'm just wondering why young people are using this process. So you're showing us that in the overwhelming majority of the cases, it's found to be unsubstantiated. They're worried about not being believed, right? Presumably there's some risk of retaliation, especially young people that are writing these grievances against staff. And you told us what kind of the myths are around why they're doing it, but given that you interviewed formerly incarcerated survivors, I'm just wondering if you have a sense from the interviews with them, like what did they get out of this? Like even if it's not going to necessarily show up to validate them officially, is there something emotionally, like do they believe in the process and then are surprised? Kind of what's going on for them as they are engaging in this process?
Yes, thank you for that, Joss. I appreciate it. Yeah, so the formerly incarcerated survivors that I interviewed, because I was doing this, did my first interview in March 2020, and the world went on fire. So I ended up interviewing a lot of people that were formerly incarcerated either in the late 1990s or early 2000s. And so those folks, for the most part, there were a handful. For the most part, they were not actually around when the PREA standards were passed, which was in 2012. And really, even though they were passed in 2012, didn't really start getting out there until maybe 2014 or 15. And so actually, out of the 23 survivors I interviewed, only one had filed a formal PREA report. And that one person did believe that the system, believed very much so. I think he was complaining that one of the other youth had continuously flashed him. And so he was very sure that because this was, caught on camera and other witnesses were around, that this was something that was going to be dealt with. And in fact, it was not. It was unsubstantiated. They told him he was a troublemaker, and he actually ended up losing his job that he had at that particular facility. And so he was really shocked by that. I think what I do plan to do, because I don't have a lot of people who've gone through the process, that's sort of the next stage. The question you're asking is sort of the next stage. And I don't mean that as a cop-out, but it really is like, I'm so curious to know why people are filing this. And is it, one of the things I've been thinking through as well is this idea around false allegations, that people use PREA to see the nurse, to get a transfer somewhere, to kick somebody out. And so if people feel that the only way I can get a new room assignment, or the only way I can see the nurse, or the only way that I can get whatever I need to survive this institution is to PREA something, people might use that, and I don't have a ton of evidence for that, but that's how I've been sort of thinking about how people might be using PREA as this form of survival. And so if that means sort of exaggerating a claim to be able to do those things, they'll do that as well. But I do think in the evidence that I presented today, boys especially, I do think that they use PREA as a way to sort of assert a heteromasculine identity. There was so much talk about this or that being gay, and I don't want people doing gay stuff to me. And so it is a way, I think, for them to be able to assert that heteromasculinity, to assert their, I guess by not saying something, maybe they feel there's a weakness in that. And so I think there's a lot of room to try to figure out what's actually going on there. But those are some of the reasons that sort of pop up in my mind as to why people would use it. But I will say, PREA, generally speaking, I forgot to mention it. So the formerly incarcerated survivors I interviewed, even though they weren't around in youth detention facilities when PREA was a thing, they were incarcerated as adults when PREA was a thing. And so they talked about filing PREA complaints as adults and how they thought it was a joke, it had no teeth, but also felt like it was their only way to be able to complain against some of the things that were happening. So I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully in the next 5 years, I'll be able to get more data on that. Thank you, Joss.
Awesome, thank you. And we have another question from Justin.
Hi, Amber. Thanks so much for your
Hi.
presentation. Really interesting stories, and it's nice to get a little bit out of the kind of static research and hear real people's takes on things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I have kind of an observation and a question. So
Yeah.
I thought as you were presenting, it struck me just how much discussion there was of LGBT folks.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of got me thinking, well, people are sort of housed by perceived gender identities. So
Right.
kind of where it would, I mean, that's who you're around, right? So
Right.
start to get into that kind of toxic conversation about gay for the stay or whatever. And
Yeah.
so I think it's just interesting to evaluate what kind of overrepresentation could be in the data.
Right.
And so I appreciate that you kind of talked about some of that stuff. But my actual question is, across all of your interviews, I'm wondering if you started to see common themes about solutions, like whether PREA should be amended in some way, or facilities should implement things differently, and whether you saw trends either from the victims or the investigators. Did you come across anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's definitely, I would say, a real disconnect between how the sort of formal legal actors, practitioners were talking about PREA versus the survivors that I interviewed. So for a lot of the investigators, they had a very sort of reformist attitude on PREA. And most of them were not naive about it. They had very, I guess, similar politics to what maybe a lot of us do, in terms of they talked about the need for decarceration. And I won't say any of them were necessarily abolitionists, but they certainly talked about, we incarcerate too many youth, incarceration, we're sort of incarcerating ourselves into more and more problems. And they talked about racial disparities and about issues with LGBTQ folks and stuff. And so they were very well versed in that language. But I think when it came down to solutions, it was still about, they still landed on, we need to strengthen investigations. We need to strengthen criminal investigations. We need more prosecution for women who are accused of this. There was a lot of talk, because the rates of sexual victimization for women are so high. There was a lot of talk about, well, if we're going to treat women the same, they need to be held to a similar accountability as we would hold men. I would argue we don't really hold anyone accountable, but that was how people were talking about it. And so it was really about, well, PREA is not perfect, but considering what it was when I started in the 1980s or the 1990s, it's gotten us a lot closer, right? Like, people are talking about, it's precisely that people are having conversations around where LGBTQ youth should be housed that didn't sort of exist before. And that there had been, the division between sort of the old school way of thinking and the new school way of thinking. But yeah, they pretty much came down on, how do we make PREA stronger and what standards would we add? And a lot of them were really afraid, because I did some of these interviews before the election. They were really afraid about the Trump administration and how to, look, we're doing the best we can. So if this is all we can do for right now, I will take that in terms of PREA. Now, I did interview also a group of anti-prison activists who were very much in line with a more abolitionist way of thinking, that the problem is not bad PREA. The problem is the institutions that are holding these people, that even if you professionalize strip searches, it's still a strip search. And that most of these kids are coming from communities where they've experienced sexual abuse from parents, from relatives, from whoever else. And then you're putting them in this situation where you constantly have guards looking at them and surveilling them, and professionalizing that, or making sure that someone who's a different gender isn't looking at them, is not really addressing the root of that trauma that comes from the institutions themselves. So there's a handful of people who thought about that. When it came to the survivors, they didn't really talk about reforms that they wanted to see, but they certainly, again, didn't believe that PREA was, they didn't believe it was helpful. In fact, in the same way that people talk about being Me Too'd, they talked about PREA in that way. So being PREA'd, right? And needing to PREA this or PREA that. And so it was actually really a joke for a lot of the people that I interviewed. And some actually didn't even know what it was, because they're like, yeah, we didn't, but maybe that was in a handbook or something, but that was never, no one ever talked to me about it. So I can't say they necessarily had reforms, but certainly didn't believe that it was necessarily a helpful reform.
Great, thank you. Hannah, question?
Yeah, hi Amber. It's
Hey,
always
Hannah.
such a joy to see you present. This is wonderful. I wanted
Always.
to just take a minute for thinking about, you mentioned this a little bit, but to just maybe give more space to it if we have time, of, what you found through your interviews versus what you found through your investigative reports, and just kind of the process of, like, even if it didn't really fit in today's presentation, I'd love to just hear more about, like, those investigative reports in and of themselves. That seems like a very
Yeah.
unique, rare difficult, very difficult thing to get. And then the fact that they were heavily redacted. And you mentioned once or twice about like how those two things went together, like you maybe saw similar stories in those different data pools. I'm wondering if you saw any disjunctures or like lingering questions or just like the ways that those two things were working together.
Yeah, I think the similarities came. So have another paper that I'm doing, and it's called A Theory of Coercive Sexual Control. And I'm talking about the sort of penal norms and practices that survivors experience, like things like strip searches and whatnot, and how they experience sexual violence, not necessarily sort of interpersonally, but institutionally. And so we see that come up quite a bit in the investigative reports. I think what we don't see in the investigative reports was kind of what Joss was getting at, which is like the motivations for why people come forward. We know most don't, and so I wanted to know more about why people were coming forward, what that process was like. And the other thing I didn't get a chance to see, and I was able to parse it out for some folks, but I didn't get a chance to see race, right? So the investigative reports completely covered up race, and for the most part, they covered up the age. So I'm like, okay, are these like 12-year-olds? Are these 16-year-olds? You know, what does that sort of look like? And I think what was really interesting about those reports as well was looking through the investigators' notes, because that included well, actually before the investigators' notes, also looking at things like letters, you know, so the fact that you're including love letters and you're reading really intimate and personal things that girls are talking about with each other, and that this is sort of used to say, you know, sexual misconduct has occurred, see, you know, exhibit 2B, and this is like a love letter that people write all the time. I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, to see the investigators' notes and how they're sort of thinking through the process and emailing each other back and forth, asking for certain things. What I found also really interesting was, and I didn't include much of it today, interviews with the accused, especially accused staff members. And so what would happen in these interviews is you sit down, they're given their rights, they're given an opportunity to have a representative there if they want. And they'll just ask them, okay, hey, did you look at this kid in the shower? No, I didn't. Okay, are you sure? Yes. And, you know, this sort of wraps up the interview. And it's very clear that, you know, whose side that, you know, someone's sort of taking in that. And so that's the reason I love the investigative reports, is that it sort of puts all of that together. And because I didn't have the survivors that I was speaking to didn't really have experience with the internal grievance process, I didn't get much of that kind of data with them. Now, what I did get with those survivors was the long-term impacts of this compounded sexual violence. So in those interviews, those were life history interviews. We didn't just sit down and talk about the juvenile detention facilities. We would start talking and I would say, can you tell me about your life growing up? And then they would talk about sexual abuse in the home, sexual abuse by the boyfriend. And then an hour in, then we get to sexual abuse in these juvenile detention facilities. And then we talk about, well, what does that impact have on your life now? And that was really, I think, the direction that those interviews went in, less about the sort of formal policies and more about what that has done to their sense of sexual citizenship as they're reentering society, as they're trying to have relationships. I talked to survivors who said, I can't undress in front of my boyfriend. I don't feel comfortable with that. I don't feel comfortable with him looking at me because it reminds me of what I had to go through in these facilities. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a long-winded way of saying, like, I think I get some different things with both, but I definitely see a lot of overlaps, especially when we're talking about these sort of sexual degradation ceremonies that people complain about.
Fantastic, thank you. Are there other questions? I definitely have several, but want to give space to other people. Okay, so one comment that just occurred to me is when you're talking about the kind of love letters being used as evidence, it
Yeah.
struck me as kind of a parallel with the resistance literature, where there's
Yeah.
so much stuff that just by virtue of the context and the status of people as prisoners, people living in prison, a lot of behaviors that are just normal human behavior are seen as resistance. And it's like,
Right.
that's weird. And then like, but on the flip side, there are other contexts where, like literally you can't have consensual relationships, especially with like between staff and residents, where it's like, literally like legally speaking, you can, like, even if you think it's consensual, sorry, I keep messing up that word.
Right.
It's like legally speaking, it's not. So it's funny how like there are sometimes where it's like, it's super gross where you're saying, not you, but like other people are
Right.
saying because of the context, it's, this, where it's like, no, they're just being human beings. Whereas in other cases, it's like, no, like we really do kind of have to kind of have a special standard. So one of
Yeah.
my questions is, so you'd mentioned how a lot of the male youth are kind of leveraging these PREA complaints to kind of protect their and assert their kind of heteronormative masculinity and stuff. I was really curious because my understanding is a lot of sexual assault is disproportionately against not heterosexual people, but especially against gay and bisexual and other categories. And so I was really curious. I'm assuming they don't all. I mean, I don't, not everybody is going to be out and stuff, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about them, because I'm just assuming that they're not using this to say like, hey, look at my heteronormative masculinity.
Right.
So I was just curious to hear about what some of that looked like.
Yeah. You're talking about among boys who identified as gay?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
Yeah. So there was in the investigative reports, there was actually only, well, no, I shouldn't say that. What I would see in those reports was it was not the victim who was identifying as gay, but it was the accused who identified as gay. And so when so I'll give an example. There's one case where a boy, he had struck a friendship with this guy, and he knew that a lot of the other people in the correctional facility didn't want to be friends with him because he was openly gay. But he was like, well, he was really nice, and I didn't fit in either, whatever. So they strike a friendship, and over the course of this friendship, the boy who identifies as gay starts asking the other boy if he's gay himself, right? And the other boy says, well, no, I'm not, stop asking. And then he keeps finding ways to ask questions about his sexual identity, like, oh, have you ever thought about that, or whatever. And so then that boy distances himself and then files a PREA complaint saying, hey, I don't feel comfortable with this guy asking me all these questions. And then the interview or the investigation also includes an interview with the boy who identifies as gay. And he says, well, look, I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. Like, I just, he seemed really nice. He was really sweet to me. I thought maybe he might like me. And I felt really terrible for this kid because the investigation got substantiated and he had to be transferred to an entirely different facility, basically for asking questions about sexuality, right? So that was typically where I would see boys talk about being gay in the investigative reports. Now, for the boys that I interviewed, several of them did talk about being bisexual and having a lot of conflicting emotions around maybe early sexual abuse that they experienced and what that meant for their sexual identity, and felt like they couldn't really work through that. So when I would ask, like, what your sexual orientation is at the end of the interview, they struggled with that because they're like, well, I mean, it's been kind of like a journey for a lot of them, but they pulled from their experiences, unfortunately, of sexual abuse to sort of help make that determination as to whether or not they were gay or not. So, yeah, that was really disturbing, but interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I was also super fascinated by the fact that female staff were more reported on, and I was really curious, do you have a sense on it? Is that like what the actual landscape of sexual abuse looks like, or is it more that women are more likely to be reported, which I don't know if you can actually, empirically figure that out, because like, the hidden iceberg basically. But I was just curious about that.
Well, yeah. So the two quantitative survey data sets that we have. So there's the National Survey of Youth in Custody, which is like sort of the self-reports of youth themselves. They indicate that it's roughly 90%. And then if you look at the Survey of Sexual Victimization, which is those formal reports, they have slightly lower numbers, but would still indicate that women are sort of disproportionately represented as in staff sexual abuse. I'm still trying to work on how and why that is, because, and that's actually a whole nother paper that I'm doing that's just talking about these constructions of women sex offenders within this context. So when I would ask that question to PREA folks, their thing was, well, in corrections, we have a lot of frumpy women who are ugly or who don't, not getting it at home or feel unloved. And so they strike these relationships with these boys who in turn are very manipulative and sophisticated, and they hone in on all of these insecurities that women correctional officers have and use them to get snacks or whatever sort of commissary stuff that they need. And so they talk about it. They're still using the sort of language of women as sexually passive and boys, even though they're boys, as aggressive and hypersexual and able to able to manipulate these women, these grown women who have much more power than they do into these types of relationships. So, I'm hesitant to still trying to sort of work on how to think about that. I mean, is that a myth? Is that what happens? I need to sort of still empirically investigate that, but that was certainly how people thought about that. And that was in other work too. Dana Britton's work talked about women correctional officers, talked about feeling like there was a sense that they could be easily manipulated and that they would have these relationships with guards, and that sort of affected how they interacted with them. And so I did see quite a bit of that in my work too, where women practitioners were talking about avoiding and distancing themselves so that they don't appear to be susceptible to that sort of thing.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Are there other questions? Okay, so if everyone can join me again on a virtual round of applause. So thank you so much, Amber, for that wonderful talk.
Thanks everyone for showing up. And if other folks have questions, always feel free to hit me up. I'm happy to talk more and be in conversation with you all.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.